Welcome to the third unit of our course on American literature. Now, last week we ended with this very optimistic movement in American literature, American Romanticism, and specifically American Transcendentalism. It was very optimistic. Transcendentalists believed that mankind could achieve anything, that democracy would flourish, but after the Romantic period, as this usually goes, there was a move in the opposite direction, a reaction in the opposite direction, and that opposite direction we call realism. I have here a number of definitions of what that means. William Dean Howells, one realist, said, actually it's nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of material. The Norton Anthology of American Literature says that American literature seeks to create the illusion of everyday life being lived by ordinary people in familiar surroundings. So no more of this mountain wildness stuff, but real people in real cities, etc. Life seen through a clear glass window, okay, as if you were recording it. George Eliot, not an American, but a British author, a woman, by the way, talked about it as the faithful representing of commonplace things. So it was very down to earth, reflecting reality. Let's have a look at some more definitions of realism before we have a quick look at what caused this shift in thought from very optimistic to somewhat less optimistic. There are different kinds of realism. Apart from the basic tendency to reflect the reality of real life as it takes place around us, we can distinguish between a number of subcategories. Some of them overlap, of course. Categories tend to overlap, but it is sometimes good to name them. One of them is called naturalism. Now, in naturalism, we see a combination of authors who not only reflect life in all its detail, but go beyond that by adding what we call a deterministic element. And what that means is that artists assumed that man was determined to be who he was and how he became by heredity, so you know what's in your genes, by your environment, and by fate. This can be quite grim. Naturalist literature is often quite grim and pessimistic, and quite the opposite of what the Transcendentalists believed in. Obviously, man no longer had fate in his own hands. He was now at the mercy of forces he could not control. This photograph, for example, was taken of a girl called Addie Card, 12 years old. The picture was taken in 1910 by a man called Louis Hine. I will show you some more pictures he took in one of the other small lectures. Sometimes this kind of realism would evolve into something which we now call muckraking. The term was coined by Theodore Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt to be president, who did not like this kind of thing. Muckraking was the kind of journalism, and of course that includes photography, which was meant to make people aware of the terrible reality of some people's lives and what the kind of life that people lived at this moment was like. The poverty, the poor working conditions. And although Roosevelt objected this type of photography, like this one also, did cause some reforms to take place. For example, it caused new legislation on child labor. So ADI card, there were no ADI cards later in that century. Such muckraking also involved novels. For example, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. This one is about the lives of immigrants working in the meat packing industry in Chicago, and that's what this picture is of. One final distinctive type of realism is something we call local color or regional realism. This was a form that described in very lively detail and also with the sort of sounds and accents particular regions and regional habits, regional language, the types of lives that people in certain regions lived. One of the famous ones, a local color author, is Kate Chopin. We have here her book called Bayou Folk. It is a collection of short stories. She wrote about the lives of the inhabitants of New Orleans, the city where she spent a number of years with her husband. You will also be reading The Awakening. In the other course, you'll be following New Voices. Her work is suffused with the atmosphere of a part of the South which traces much of its ancestry to the French. So we have the names and the cadence of French and French culture and the French language. But one of the greatest realists, and really a giant of the local color genre, is one of our authors, and that's Mark Twain, who wrote, of course, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Huckleberry Finn was published in 1884 and is considered by many people the great American novel. It is also hotly debated, sometimes even blacklisted and forbidden. And those of you who are reading this novel, perhaps you can tell us a bit more about why that is when you post your comments. As he said about it himself, he said, "This novel is a book of mine where a sound heart and a deformed conscience come into collision, and conscience suffers defeat." With conscience, of course, he means that thing constructed by society, which tells us what is right and what is wrong. And in this novel, that is superseded by the sound heart of this semi-illiterate boy, Huckleberry Finn. He is the one who has the sound heart, and his heart is sound enough to choose for what everybody thinks is wrong. The question, which has remained unanswered in this particular lecture, is what it was that prompted American authors to turn away from this very positive idea about mankind that the Romantics had, the optimistic view on human nature, and to turn towards a much more negative view of the reality of American life. And what one of the critics, Alfred Kazin, says about this is that it actually grew out of the bewilderment and thrived on the simple grimness of a generation suddenly brought face to face with the pervasive materialism of industrial capitalism. Okay, so industrialization, the kinds of work that demanded from people, the kind of poverty it produced, that was one very important thing. As a former colleague of mine at Radboud University once said in a lecture, There was a need to look reality in the face, to describe the here and now as honestly as possible. In this way, the thin veneer of gold that obscured the hollowness, we're talking about capitalism after all, corruption and moral rot of the America's Gilded Age, and the next lecture is about that Gilded Age, in Twain's words, would be stripped away. Okay? That gilded surface would be stripped away by this very honest kind of art. Other reasons. We have industrialization, but also, and one of the other small lectures for this unit are about that, the Civil War, which very often meant that it was a war between brothers, literally brothers, or people trained together, and I will say more about that in my lecture on the Civil War. People were nearing the end of the frontier. Almost all of America was now populated by Europeans and Native Americans alike, which meant that there was no longer this West in which people could recreate themselves. I mentioned industrialization. Much of that had to do with urbanization and the way people had to live in the cities, which meant, and I'll go into that in more depth, prosperity for some, but very, very dire poverty for others. As I said, you can find out more about this in the other 2 mini lectures that I have prepared for you. So I hope you enjoy.